Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and from the B'nai Zion House in Manhattan, we have a very, very special edition of L'Chaim for you here on Shalom TV. I'm going to introduce you to a man you well know, and he's someone that I've seen. I've been in his presence, I don't know, countless times, and none of that we've spoken on camera, but I've never had the chance to sit with him across a table. He is a gentleman who has spent a lifetime in public service. He was an intimate part of both the Reagan administration and the Bush administration. He is a top National Security Council officer. He is now a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And again, it's an honor for me to sit with Elliott Abrams. Thank you so much for joining us. And as I said, I have had just the pleasure of hearing your analysis so often. But because you have written, you wrote 6 books, now you've written Tested by Zion, and I said to you off camera, and I want you to know, Elliott, I rarely do books. This is a fabulous book. This is a fabulous book. Everybody in the Jewish world is talking about Yehuda Avner's book, The Prime Ministers, a wonderful, wonderful book. And they will talk about this book. And I said to my wife last night, and I don't know if you're, how you'll feel about this. In some way, your book, Tested by Zion, picks up where Prime Ministers leaves off. The problem is neither book really deals with the Clinton administration. But it's interesting to see how Avner brings us up through the Begin years. And Yehuda Avner was a special assistant to Menachem Begin. And he wrote a book that has really gotten wonderful acclaim. And then you write a book which, Elliott, it reminds all of us who lived through the years you're talking about, which really is from the year 2000 through 2008. You remind us of so much that happened. And it is a beautifully written book. It is a book that has, by the way, it's an easy read, and at the same time, it is extraordinarily documented. Most books don't have the kind of footnotes that Elliott Abrams has put in at the end of every single chapter, with wonderful source material inside the narrative. But the narrative reads well. It's an exciting book. It's a wonderful book. And I want you to know, there was a popular notion about the Bush administration that it did very little on the peace process.
Right.
You read Tested by Zion, Elliott, you realize what an enormous effort and how much was going on through your office and the White House's office in an attempt to bring some kind of peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Anyway, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for sitting with me.
First, thank you, Mark, for having me. It's a great opportunity to reach out to so many Americans. And thank you for saying one thing that I really think is important. I wanted it to be an easy read. I wanted it to be a serious book, but I wanted to tell a lot of stories about a lot of very interesting people. It's not a textbook. No. In a sense, it's a storybook.
Yes.
Your point, I think, is really one of the reasons I wrote the book, because there is this mythology, I would say. Oh, you Bush people, maybe you tried in 2007, 2008. You ignored the Middle East for 6 years. You did nothing. People forget that George Bush comes to office, there is an intifada going on. There is the breakdown of Camp David at the very end of the Clinton administration. The Palestinian leader is Yasser Arafat. And, I start this book by telling people, I was going to say reminding, but people don't know. When one president replaces another, they hand off in a little Oval Office ceremony right before the inauguration, they have tea. Nothing serious is said. It's a formal occasion. Not on January 20th, 2001. Bill Clinton to George Bush. Clinton uses the opportunity to curse Yasser Arafat.
By the way, It's an extraordinary, the way you begin the book is brilliant, and that's an extraordinary description. I've not seen anybody write about that before, Elliott. But go ahead, talk about it.
Well, it's an extraordinary event.
He curses Arafat because
He says to Bush and Cheney, don't ever trust this man. This man lied to me. I gave him my confidence and he abused my confidence. Don't negotiate with this guy. Don't trust this guy. So people come years later and they say Bush didn't push for peace in the Middle East. With whom? With the Yasser Arafat, who Clinton had just said to him, don't ever trust this man. Don't ever deal with this man. So, and of course you have the Intifada. So what you need to do in January 2001 is figure out, can we stop the violence? Can we stop the terrorism? And that is what Bush tried to do. Now we're in the period before 9/11. That was really the main focus.
Okay. I want to take one half step back with you.
Yes, sir.
You originally worked with Scoop Jackson and Daniel Moynihan, two prominent liberal-leaning Democrats. Then you end up a top officer, security officer, involved in national security. You ultimately head, in essence, the Middle Eastern section of the White House's attempt to deal with the Middle East.
Yep.
Politically for yourself, if I saw the Scoop Jackson, and lo and behold, I see the Patrick Moynihan, and now
Right.
I see you, you're identified with the Republican administrations.
Yes.
Where do you place yourself on the political spectrum?
I was a Jackson Democrat, Scoop
Yes.
Jackson Democrat, meaning liberal on domestic policy, tough-minded on foreign policy. This is, in my view, the old Democratic Party. Harry Truman, Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Scoop Jackson. I worked for Scoop. Moynihan gets elected senator in 1976. I moved over to Moynihan's staff.
What did you do for him?
I was chief of staff for
Okay.
Pat Moynihan
Okay.
in his first
That must have been
couple of
thrilling.
years. It was an amazing experience.
And people should know, you went to Harvard Law School, now you're working for Moynihan. Where were you born?
New York City.
You're a New York
I am
kid.
I am a Queens, New York kid.
Where'd you go to high school?
We moved to Manhattan. I went to a private school in Manhattan
Okay.
after that, and then went off to.
Okay, so
to
now
Harvard.
you're working for
And then
Moynihan.
I moved to Washington to work for Scoop Jackson in 1975, sure that I'd be moving back to New York in 1 year, 2 years, and here we are. I am one of the people who basically left the Democratic Party over Jimmy Carter and his foreign policy.
I see.
Like Gene Kirkpatrick, we felt on a number of issues Carter was just taking the party in a place we could not go. So in 1980 in the election, I supported Reagan and did some work for Reagan in the Jewish community, particularly in Florida, and entered the Reagan administration as a Democrat, as a Reagan Democrat. And Reagan liked Democrats. He had been a Democrat. So there was no effort to say you should switch party. Later in the administration, Lynn Nofziger, who was the director of politics, said, when you're ready, are you ready? Do you think you're ready? And I said, yes. I don't think the Democratic Party is coming back to the Jackson-Moynihan days. So I switched parties in the 80s, and I'm a Republican.
Okay. I wanted you to talk one more moment about this dramatic way the book begins, in which Clinton is basically saying, and you'll tell me if I've got it right, at the end of Camp David, and Clinton worked very hard and thought he had a deal.
Yeah.
Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat spent a long time with him at Camp David, and in the end, there's this conversation that you record in the book, in which ultimately something like Arafat comes to Clinton and says, "You're a great president."
Yes,
And Clinton says, as you report in the book, "No, I'm not, and it's your fault."
exactly.
Okay. You weren't at Camp David, so for you, this is all at least second-hand, if not third-hand, correct?
Right.
Do you understand why Camp David under Clinton failed, and why that was what you inherited? as the Bush administration comes to power in 2000. Do you know, has anybody ever said to you, have you ever talked to Clinton about it? What really went wrong? Because in the Jewish community, when we talk about mythology, there's this mythology that ultimately Ehud Barak was willing to give 96, 97, 98%, I don't know how much, and that Arafat was this close to saying yes. And the mythology is that every time it looked like they had satisfied what Arafat had asked for, Arafat moved the line, and that the ultimate reason Arafat said no is that the refugee problem was not addressed to his satisfaction, and he could not go back to the Palestinian leadership if he didn't bring some kind of resolution of the Palestinian refugee question. Now that's what you hear, Elliott. Can you clarify any of that for the Jewish community?
There are two major explanations of what went on. One of them is from Dennis Ross, who I would say represents most the American view, the consensus American view. Rob Malley, who was also in the Clinton administration, has written a different view, a slightly different view. They're both friends of mine. Dennis Ross's view is, I would say, essentially, there was no way Arafat was ever going to sign anything, not in the end. Why? Because he was Yasser Arafat. First of all, that would have forced him to change himself from the way he viewed himself with the military uniform, revolutionary leader, into a sort of provincial governor. Guy's got to collect garbage and keep the schools open. Could Arafat make the switch? Could he change his own image of himself? No. Secondly, what had Arafat done to prepare the Palestinian people for peace? And peace means compromise on refugee questions and others. Nothing. I don't think Arafat was afraid so much of the Palestinian leadership. I think he was afraid of the Palestinian people, and I would say also Hamas. He knew he would be accused of having basically given up his whole life's work, terrorism, resistance, as he called it. He wasn't the man to do that. He couldn't do it psychologically. He couldn't do it politically. That, I think, that's Dennis's view, and I think that's basically the consensus view. Rob Malley's view is perhaps more complicated. I don't think he'd deny any of that, but he would add, Camp David was not so well prepared. Arafat didn't want to come to begin with. The conference probably shouldn't have been held. They were running out of time, which is why they had to do it then.
You mean the Clinton administration was running out of time?
Arafat felt he was ganged up on because obviously the United States and the Israelis were closer. If you add that together, I think it tells you something. We'll get to this later about 2008 and Annapolis. Arafat wasn't going to sign anything in the end. We like to think we were this close. If you believe, he wasn't a man who could ever sign anything and give up being a resistance leader, then you weren't so close because he wasn't really going to sign. I think that happened again in 2008. Olmert, former Prime Minister Olmert, says we were an inch away. I don't think they were an inch away.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Incidentally, just so our audience understands, the sweep of Tested by Zion, it includes a discussion of obviously Clinton's frustration at the 2000 Camp David meetings that Elliott has just described. It talks about the Saudi peace plan, the Karin A debacle, a ship that we'll talk about in a moment, the decline of Arafat, the rise of Abbas, Sharon's decision to withdraw from Gaza, the Bush roadmap, and again, almost every event, Annapolis, every event that occurred, and it was just amazing how much occurred in your 8 years. You wrote the following sentence. It's sort of a summary of where you feel we are, and this is what you wrote. The PA and PLO have not prepared the Palestinian people for the national concessions that any final status agreement with Israel will require. And, I wish we had 3 hours because I'd like to go through every single story you tell here, incident you tell. Each one is fascinating. But I also know that the sweep of my meeting with you is to ultimately ask you, where are we going from here? And in this section you call Lessons Learned, you wrote this passage that the PLO and the PA have not prepared the Palestinian people. Is that the problem that you felt existed in 2000 as you came to office with President Bush, that existed during your 8 years? And Elliott, are you saying in some way that you feel that remains I'm not saying the only, but a major obstacle to some resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yes, it's not the only obstacle, but you know, if you read what Palestine Media Watch or Memory come up with, you have this, people call it incitement. It's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, glorification of terrorism just about every day in the Palestinian media. This is not a preparation for peace. Peace does require compromise from the Israelis as well. No one is, you know, there's a big debate in Israel. There has been a big debate in Israel, I'd say, for 25 years at least. Give this up, give that up, compromise on this, compromise on that. This debate is not really taking place among Palestinians. So my answer is yes. That is one of the critical obstacles to peace. Palestinian leaders are not explaining to the Palestinian people, these are the compromises we have to contemplate.
People at the Washington Institute argue that there are polls being taken all the time within the Palestinian community, and that the rank and file Palestinian who lives on the West Bank, the majority, do favor a two-state solution. In your experience, how accurate is that poll? Do you believe that, in fact, the Palestinian people, the majority of them, if they believed in Israel, if they believed Israel were willing to live with them in peace, are the Palestinian people, by and large, wanting to live with Israel in peace?
Yes, but I can't give you, yes in the sense that, look, they want an end to what they view as a military occupation. They want more autonomy. They want the Israelis out of their lives more. They want peace for themselves, for their children. The question is, what are they willing to sacrifice for it?
And what are they willing to sacrifice?
Here they're divided. There was a very interesting article recently by Giora Eiland, retired Israeli Major General, former National Security Advisor to Sharon, who said, you know what the problem is? The problem is that there's something they want even more than a state, which is they want their grievance. So he's very pessimistic. He doesn't think that by saying, okay, in this area, which is not such a big area, which has no natural resources, which is going to be, if it's a state tomorrow, impoverished, tiny, not very prosperous, not very influential. Is it worth trading your grievance?
And what's the grievance?
The grievance is the creation of the state of Israel. That's
the essence of Israel, yes.
Yes, it isn't the border. That's why the maps don't show Israel. It's the creation of the state of Israel. And that's not every Palestinian. I think there are a number of many Palestinians who would like to get this over with. But you know, the problem is, this is not going to be settled by referendums. It's going to be settled by leaders negotiating. If you're a Palestinian leader, now it's Mahmoud Abbas. Over his shoulder is Hamas. Any compromises he makes, you know for a fact Hamas will say, you're a traitor. Yasser Arafat didn't throw all of that away. He didn't trade that away. He said, no, you gave it all away. Now, that takes a lot of guts. You have to be a kind of heroic, charismatic leader to make that deal. I do not think Abbas is a heroic, charismatic leader. So my view is he's not going to sign anything.
Abbas will not sign anything.
That's my view.
Okay. Incidentally, when we talked about Arafat a moment ago, one of the things that if he had the mentality to want to be a forever statesman, if he wanted his legacy to be that he was the one who, from the Palestinian side, made peace, it would have driven him in a different direction. And what you seem to be saying is that Arafat did not have the statesman mentality. Am I hearing you correctly?
That's right. I mean, there are people who have moved that way. Menachem Begin is one. Nelson Mandela, very good example, who are able to turn themselves into not just statesmen, democratic statesmen. That was not Yasser Arafat.
Is there anyone, Elliott, on the Palestinian scene who you say to yourself, there's a statesman in process? Many people in the Jewish community have been very complimentary about Fayyad, although it doesn't seem like he has any real power now within the Palestinian community. But is there anybody you see right now and you say to yourself, if that individual were to continue to grow in stature within the Palestinian community, we might have the statesman?
Not really. I mean, people point to Marwan Barghouti, who is in an Israeli prison for life, as a potential Palestinian leader. Who knows what kind of a leader he would be if he were out of prison? A word about Fayyad, who's the prime minister. I am a very great admirer of his. Problem is, he got 2 seats, his party, in the Palestinian elections in 2006. I have to say, we're part of the problem, we, the United States, in this sense. You can try for a comprehensive agreement with a handshake on the White House lawn and peace prizes for everyone. That's what was tried in the Clinton administration. That's what we tried at the end of the Bush administration. You're not helping Fayyad if you're doing that. Fayyad's job is much more pragmatic. How are the schools? How are the hospitals? Are there courts? Are there policemen? How are the roads? That's Fayyad's job. We have always marginalized that. Everybody's always going for the brass ring. I had conversations with Fayyad 2007, 2008, where he would actually say to me, Elliott, you are not helping me. You Americans, you are not helping me. You are doing this negotiating stuff with the PLO. He's not in the PLO. He's not a member of Fatah. He's the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister. We have always made that secondary, tertiary, the business of pragmatic change. I think it has been a mistake. Mistake for Clinton, mistake for Bush, mistake for Obama. Because Tony Blair once said to me, it's in the book, in an interview, he said, look, what happens in the diplomacy will reflect what is really happening on the ground. It's not vice versa. Mm-hmm. Reality doesn't reflect diplomacy. Diplomacy reflects reality. I think we should have concentrated more on changing the reality on the ground. That would have, I think, strengthened
Very
Fayyad.
interesting. And are you saying that even you had to come to learn that?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the Israelis have come to learn it. And by the way, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't get enough credit for what he has done to improve Palestinian life in the West Bank. Very pragmatic thing, not dramatic, not front page, but it has improved life on the West Bank. Yes, that was a view I came to learn in the course of doing this job and talking to Palestinians.
Okay. Does Dennis Ross understand it?
Yes. I think Dennis's view would be you need to have the negotiating track and you need to do this on the ground. I agree with that. I'm not opposed to negotiations. I don't think they're going to work, but they seem to make everybody feel better. Fine. The problem is that in the Clinton-Bush experience, they tend to swallow up everything else.
Yes.
Everybody says, sure, we'll do both. We'll do both, of course, absolutely.
And do both means?
Both means we'll have the negotiating track for a final comprehensive agreement, and we'll do pragmatic things on the ground. It doesn't work out that way. What happens is everyone is allured by the drama of a great final status agreement. You pay less and less attention to what's happening on the ground.
Is there anyone in the Obama administration now who you feel understands what you've just said and is working in this direction?
No. Secretary Kerry, when he was a senator in 2011, did say this, not his word, but obsession with settlements, a mistake. He said in 2011, we've wasted a year and a half fighting over the settlement issue. He may well understand that. But as I look at the cast of characters, the people who've negotiated in the past, Dennis Ross, Martin Indyk, are out.
In philosophical discussions of how world events move forward, there is always a debate about the power of personality and whether, in fact, there are power elites that maybe the public even can't identify, but who help shape policy within any government, whether it's democracy, a monarchy, a dictatorship. And then there is the philosophy that says the individual, the charismatic individual who is in them, right place at the right time, can be determinative. I don't want to hear from you, both are true. What I want to know from you, in your experience, you've talked here about, it made it sound like Yasser Arafat was sort of the president of a company and had the ability to say yes or no, and his own ego got in the way, and that in some way decisions of a monumental nature were made based on ego or personal worry, as opposed to, no matter what Arafat was, he was responsible to a Palestinian structure somewhere, just as, in fact, as powerful as a president must be, no president acts alone. And I understand personality is very important, especially as in a democracy, the president can motivate the public to support or to reject a given policy. But I want to understand from your perspective, as you've experienced this, so it's your whole career, how do you balance the issue of personality?
Right.
A Ronald Reagan, a George Bush, a Clinton, a President Obama, an Arafat, a Netanyahu. To what extent is history really driven by the, and I'm going to use a pejorative term, the petty concerns of ego that gets in the way? To what extent, obviously personality is critical, especially in terms of communication, but that your sense is that the public has to understand, our audience has to understand, that there are, that the person whom we see is representing something larger than himself, and the individuals who are in positions of ultimate power are always aware that they do not make the decision that a Mark Golub might make for Shalom TV.
First, the idea that there are sort of secret cabals and so forth, very Middle Eastern conspiracy theory, no, that doesn't explain what happens. What explains what happens is people. It isn't so much, vast tides of history. They exist. Israel has 7 million people. It can't decide to have 100 million people. You work within constraints, but within those constraints, people, individuals. It's Yasser Arafat who said no.
It is Yasser Arafat.
Yasser Arafat. Of course, working, he's looking around him. He's looking at Palestinian politics, Arab politics. It's Bill Clinton. It's Ariel Sharon. It's George Bush. Of course, we're all the sum of the influences on us. We all make mistakes. I think you find with Democratic politicians in the West a real effort most of the time to do the right thing as people see it. Of course, how they see it depends on who they are, but personality is the critical thing here. 30 years ago, I think it is now, Steven Spiegel wrote a book about how U.S. policy toward Israel is made. And he's still teaching at UCLA, and he said he analyzed every theory, the bureaucratic theory and the lobbying theory and the this theory, and he came out and said, you want to know how U.S. policy toward Israel is made? By the President of the United States. And that's right. In the end, it's not the State Department, it's not the CIA, it's not DOD, it's not lobbies, it's not Congress, it's the President. And I think that's still true, and it's true for these other entities as well. You would have had a different policy on Gaza if it had not been Ariel Sharon. You would have had a different reaction in 2006 when Hezbollah came across the border and killed some Israelis if it had not been Ehud Olmert. So people, in a sense, it may be a disappointing answer to some people, but I think it is the right answer.
I think it's an important answer. It's an important answer, and it's important for you to have said it. There's a fascinating sentence you wrote in Tested by Zion where you say, President Bush, was at his most effective at bringing peace closer when he defied conventional wisdom. And you do describe in your book the tension between the State Department and the White House.
Yeah.
And so as you talk about personality, I'm saying to myself, how did that play into the, I don't know the right word, political problems or simply life problems that you, as part of the White House, encountered, because there was a State Department?
Yes.
And what were the ways in which your administration, the Bush administration, defied conventional wisdom?
Let me give you the best example of this.
Please.
2002. George Bush says in a June speech, big speech about the Middle East, I am for a Palestinian state, he says, but not with Yasser Arafat. Arafat must go. Palestinians need new leadership that is not compromised by terror and corruption.
Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
That was a very dramatic thing for him to say at the time, was
Absolutely.
it not?
It was. People have to remember something. In the Clinton years, who was the foreign figure who visited the White House most often? Was it Tony Blair? No, Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat. He was the path to peace. So here's George Bush.
After Oslo, he won a Nobel Peace Prize.
I know, it's really stunning. Bush knew that he would be denounced for this. He made that speech and then he went to a Group of 8 meeting with European leaders. And he said at the time, he knew he was going to be the skunk at the garden party, because they all thought, this is idiotic, this is stupid, it is ignorant, it means there can be no negotiations, it means there can be no peace. It was a very bold thing, and the State Department didn't want him to do it. The drafting of that speech, 32 drafts, and the president participated in several sessions of drafting, which is unheard of. Be it a big meeting, there's 10 people at varying levels, and the president's sitting there with a pen. The funny thing about it is that Rumsfeld and Cheney said to him, you don't need to give another speech about the Middle East. Why do you have to give another Middle East speech? He had given one in April. Colin Powell in the State Department said, no, you need to explain the policy better, more. Powell came to regret that because he hated the speech. The whole State Department hated the speech.
Because?
They believed what we had believed in the past. That is, you may not like Arafat, he's not a nice guy, he's not somebody, but you must deal with him. He's the only pathway to peace. And so for Bush to say, no, I will not deal with him, and there cannot be a Palestinian state until that terrorist leadership is gone, that was really junking what the conventional wisdom had been.
That's amazing. Were you part of that decision?
I was not. I was not part of that decision. I was consulted a little bit because at this point I had a different job in the administration.
Okay.
I was in the National Security Council where I was handling the UN and human rights and democracy. Condi Rice talked to me about that speech. She showed me a draft and asked me to look at it, but it was not my draft.
Okay. Who else was closest to Bush who was at least on board with him in that orientation?
Well, the first person you have to mention is Vice President Cheney. And it's funny because, Cheney was very close to the Arabs after the first Gulf War. Then he had gone to Texas where he ran Halliburton, which made most of its money, I think, in the Middle East. And a lot of pro-Israel people thought he would be anti-Israel. And Cheney was a rock for Israel. He really was, including on this speech and on the question of Arafat. We should talk about the Karin A for a minute to explain,
what
Bush
happened
and
there.
Cheney. January 20th, 2001, Bush comes to office. You have that conversation with Bill Clinton. Bush never met with Arafat. Powell, on several visits out there, met with Arafat. And Arafat would make all the claims that you wanted him to make. I'm for peace, I'm for this, I'm for that. In January 2002, a ship known as the Karin A is intercepted by the Israelis. It is a ship full of Iranian arms purchased by Yasser Arafat going around from Iran to Gaza. So the Israelis capture it, of course, show it to us. We see immediately what it is. We know what it is. We ask Arafat about it. He lies and lies and lies. So what do the president and vice president learn from this? First of all, Bill Clinton is right. He's a complete liar. You cannot trust a single word he says. Secondly, he's the father of terrorism now. It isn't the 1980s. It isn't the 1990s. Now, as he sits across the table from American officials and mouths all these words about peace, he is building up arsenals for terror from Iran. So by June, the president and the vice president had really come to the conclusion he's got to go. And those were really the two most important people. And I would say Condi Rice, as National Security Advisor, went along and certainly facilitated this agreement, as did, of course, the speechwriters.
Okay. By the way, in essence, the Bush administration may have tried to marginalize Arafat, but he really isn't out of the picture until he dies, correct?
You're absolutely right. You know, we and the Europeans forced him to create the post of prime minister, to give that post some responsibilities on paper, to appoint a prime minister, Mahmoud Abbas, who's now president. And we thought in the spring of 2003, this has all been done, you know, this is great. We are really marginalizing Arafat. Maybe there's a road ahead to peace. By the end of that summer, a few weeks later, Abbas is out. Arafat has totally defeated and marginalized him, and by the way, defeated us as well, is 100% in charge. You know, one of the reasons I think Arafat did this, by the way, in the summer of 2003, we had, first the president met with Abbas in Aqaba, Jordan. Then we had him come to the White House, and they did a thing on the White House lawn. This is exactly what Yasser Arafat had done 10 times. Only now there's a different Palestinian with the president. I think he was jealous, he was envious, and he decided, I'm not going to put up with this, I'm going to get rid of this guy.
As you look at Abbas now, is Abbas what you wanted him to be, what you hoped he would be?
No. He is in one way, and it's important, and credit should be given. He's against violence. In the Aqaba summit in 2003, he stood next to Sharon and Bush, and he said he was against all violence, against all Israelis anywhere, both for the pragmatic reason that they're going to lose, and morally. He said, we don't want to develop that kind of culture. He said the armed intifada is over. And I think he's been consistent with that. He understands that violence and terror is a loser for the Palestinians. Where he has not been strong, though, is as a leader for peace, in the sense that he turned down this really quite generous offer from Ehud Olmert, and he's since then, and it's 4 years, not been willing to come to the negotiating table with the excuse of settlement construction, which is an excuse. So as a peacemaker, a disappointment.
I want to make sure I do not miss a very important philosophical question to ask you. It goes beyond simply the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the American-Jewish community. I'm asking you now, as somebody who has spent a professional career inside the halls of government, how the United States should behave in its own role in any conflict, specifically here, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is every now and then, even within the liberal Jewish community, and when I say liberal, I'm not trying to splinter it, I'm saying that in general, there is a liberal attitude to American Jewry. It doesn't mean that they're not conservative in certain areas, but that overall there's a sort of an embrace.
Sure.
We want this to be as wonderful a world, and we want everybody to be cared for to the extent to which an economy can afford to do it, and which way we can work out a way to do it. And that most Jews, wherever they are in the spectrum, want to see some peace between Israel and the
Sure.
neighbors. How you get it, people disagree. And the question becomes, can the United States be an honest broker?
Mm-hmm.
And when President Obama came to office in his first term, there seemed to be an approach within the Obama administration that said, America has perceived to be leaning too much towards Israel.
Yes.
I don't want, I'm now speaking for the administration, I believe they would say, we don't want to be anti-Israel, but we want to in some way engender trust within the Arab community as well. And if the Arab world sees Israel, sees America as only pro-Israel, you referred to this at even Camp David when you said Arafat felt outnumbered because the U.S. does lean towards Israel. If the Arab world can't feel that the United States is coming here in more of an impartial way, then why should they entrust their own future to a United States overlord of sorts that will sort of come in and say, okay, now we'll work this out? At the same time, I'm an American Jew, and I look at the Middle East conflict and I say to myself, I know what Israelis want. And wherever they are on the spectrum, the vast majority of American Jews and the vast majority of Israelis understand there will be a sharing of the land in some way. Now the question is, how do we move to that?
Yes.
And that I therefore feel, and I don't apologize for it, I believe that Israel is ready more than the Palestinian community has been ready to make peace, and I want the United States to reflect its understanding of that reality. So for me, I want America to be pro-Israel. But is my wish that America be pro-Israel in some way, Elliott, counterproductive to the possible role America can play as, this impartial superpower that will say to both the Israeli and the Palestinian, we will not be partial. We will see both of you as you are, with legitimate grievances, legitimate claims, and we will try to help you work it out. That's a long way of asking you to where do you believe the United States foreign policy should be as it relates to its closest ally, Israel, while it at the same time wants to be this honest broker of peace between two very different worldviews?
A very important question. The periods of the most intense negotiations, the Clinton years and the Bush years, are the periods of, I would argue, the closest U.S.-Israel cooperation. Why? Because the answer to your question is, we can't be a peace broker unless we are that close to Israel. Not only are they not in conflict, they're both essential. Israel is the country that is risking its security by any of these agreements. By getting out of South Lebanon, it took a risk. By getting out of Sinai, by getting out of Gaza. And if someday there is a withdrawal back toward the fence in the West Bank, huge security risks. And we know that in the cases of South Lebanon and Gaza, not just risks, terrorist attacks. What are the Israelis getting for making these withdrawals? Are they getting peace? They have not gotten peace. They got peace with Egypt. A cold peace, but it is peace. The risks they have to take can only be taken, I think, in conjunction with reliance on the firmest, the closest possible relationship with the United States. First. Second, the Israelis want peace, and you use the right term, Israeli-Arab peace, not just Israeli-Palestinian. The Palestinians can't give them that. They want the rest of it. How is that going to get worked out? Also requires the United States' involvement. I was, clearly known as being very pro-Israel, and I'm a Jew. I had no trouble working with the Palestinians, and I had no trouble working, with very few exceptions, with the Arabs. Because the truth is, the Arabs face enormous challenges too. I don't mean the Palestinians. I mean the rest, Gulf Arabs, for example, and now with Iran. They want to know what kind of a friend the United States is. when they see us being a loyal and reliable and strong and tough friend to Israel, they say to themselves, that's what I want. I want them to be a loyal, reliable, tough friend to me too. If they see us distancing ourselves from Israel, then they think, whoa, wait a minute. The Israelis and they were closer. So if that's what they'll do to the Israelis, where am I going to end up? So being a reliable ally, being a reliable friend, being a close friend to Israel, I think is essential for the United States if we're going to promote negotiations. And I would argue that Bill Clinton and George Bush showed that that's true.
I want to push you one more moment. I want to give you a chance to answer a question I know somebody watching right now wants to hear you address. You are a Jew. There's a possibility that you have a bias that colors the way you look at this. And as professional a statesman you are and a diplomat you are, and as professional as you've been throughout your entire career, perhaps you are swayed by your own, who you are, where you came from, what your commitment is to the Jewish people. And maybe when you write or when you talk, you have a predisposition to the pro-Israeli view, which in some way gets in the way of a more objective, dispassionate individual who has sat in the same seats you have sat in. So I want you to address that for anyone who might be watching and saying, of course Elliott Abrams is going to say that. He's a Jew. What do you say?
First, of course, we are all the sum of our lives. If I were a Christian and I were talking to you about the threats that the Copts face in Egypt, then people could say, well, he's a Christian, of course he's concerned about it. So this is going to happen to anybody. First answer. Second answer, you know, George Bush was an evangelical Christian. Dick Cheney, a Protestant. Condi Rice is, I believe, a Baptist. I'm a Jew. Colin Powell, I think, is also a Protestant. There's a big team of people working on this. So you have to believe, and of course, in the Middle East, people might believe, this Jewish guy brainwashed all of them. That explains why they came out where they did. But, you know, it's kind of ludicrous. The team we had reflected America. We had Christians and Jews. We had people of many backgrounds. My deputy was an Indian American. You know, we have to check ourselves always. But it's an interesting thing that people sometimes are surprised to see. When Israeli and Palestinian negotiators would get together, many people who were new to this thought, will they talk to each other? I mean, would they shake hands? Shake hands! They hug and kiss. They've known each other for years. They have, in many cases, a warm personal relationship. There are many occasions on which I would meet the Palestinian leadership. How do you greet each other? Kisses on both cheeks. So I think what the Palestinians were looking for was American officials who understood the situation and could deliver. How do you, from their point of view, that means deliver Israel. How do you get Israel to make the compromises that it will have to make? By being an American official who is cold and doesn't understand them and doesn't know them, or by being an American official whom the Israelis trust? So I did not find, it's an interesting thing because I have been asked this question by Americans. I did not really find this from Palestinians. And by the way, it's funny, I mentioned before who had been the two leading Democratic Party figures doing this, Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk, who were also both Jews. And they had, I think it's fair to say, excellent relations with the Arabs as well. So perhaps surprisingly, I don't think this has been a problem.
Okay. There seemed to be a different philosophy, especially when President Obama first became president and went to Cairo. It seemed to me that what he was trying to say was, this is a new American administration. There was a lot of criticism of the Bush administration from within the Obama administration.
Sure.
In terms of how they handled the Middle East policy.
Yes.
And it seemed as if what the president was saying was, this is a new America,
right,
which will reach out its hand to not only shake but embrace
Yes.
the Muslim world, and that this is a departure from prior American policy, and he was referring to the Bush administration. Would you comment on how you reacted to that Cairo initiative and to that notion that somehow the Bush administration was not embracing enough, and here comes the Obama administration to correct a failure of your administration?
First, you have to give the administration, the Obama administration, a break in one way. Every administration thinks the guys who came before them were a bunch of dopes. Even within a party. I mean, the George H.W. Bush administration toward the Reagan people. A bunch of dopes, get them out of here. This is natural.
Except you were both, so you're not a dope.
So there is that view.
Yes.
We're new, we're going to
Yes,
do things new,
absolutely.
different, better.
Right.
Secondly, there was and this I think is a mistake, and I blame the Obama administration for it. There was a hostility toward Bibi Netanyahu. Remember that the president became president first. Netanyahu actually becomes prime minister now for a second time after Obama is already in the White House. So it cannot be that they were mad at him for something he had just done. The people who didn't like him, who I think included Rahm Emanuel, didn't like him from before. And also because, look, we have a left of center president, they have a right of center prime minister. That's always going to be a difficult relationship. And it was. I think the administration went too far with it. There were clearly personal problems from day one. And hard to avoid, but you have to avoid it. It's your job to try to avoid it and work around it. To that, I would add a third thing. It gets closer to what you're saying. I think the president did think we were too close to Israel and that daylight would be useful. That was a mistake for the reasons I explained a few minutes ago. You do better with the Israelis. Indyk, former ambassador to Israel, says in his memoir, you get a lot more. We found in the Clinton administration, he says, a lot more from the Israelis when you're hugging them than when you're distancing yourself from them.
And you don't necessarily lose with the Palestinians, even though you're hugging Israel.
That is my view. And so the president made a mistake in not going from Cairo in 2009 to Jerusalem. Because then he could have said, I want a new and different relationship with the Muslim world, but the same close relationship with Israel. The impression by not going to Israel was he actually wants distance. There's a famous conversation that he had with Malcolm Hoenlein,
Yes,
president of the Conference
at the
of
White
Presidents,
House,
where Malcolm asked him, are you trying to create daylight? You know, Bush said we don't want daylight. And the president said, well, they had no daylight, but they had no progress either, which I think was wrong. That's another thing that I think was, you know, we had basically, after Arafat left, he died at the end of the first term, so we had 4 years of negotiations. We had what Sharon did in Gaza. We had Annapolis. And in their 4 years, candidly, in the president's first term, there's been nothing. So I think, let me say, I hope that in the second term, the people who are taking a look at this policy will take a new look and will say, you know, maybe a closer relationship with the Israelis will actually make things easier.
Yes. By the way, there seems to be a different tone of discussion when it comes out of the White House now about American-Israeli relations. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I hope it's because there has been a view that, look, that didn't work great in the first term. Wasn't good for them, wasn't good for the United States. Let's try it. Of course, Israel has a different government coalition, perhaps more flexibility on some of the issues that the president cares about, different Secretary of State. So, you know, maybe there's a new mix. Maybe, I hope.
Okay. Talk to me about settlements for one moment. The President Obama, came to office and defined settlements as the primary obstacle to peace.
Right.
And this triggered a whole series of events, policies, arguments, and one of the things that's often said is that he forced Mahmoud Abbas to take a position harsher on settlements because he couldn't let the president out Palestinian him.
Yes.
And I want to ask you then, when you were in the White House, had we had this conversation and you had to represent the Bush administration's policy on settlements. And I asked you then, Elliott Abrams, are settlements illegal? Are the Israeli settlements illegal? And I want to stress that because there's a difference between being unwise and illegal. Would you have said to me,
no.
I'm going to ask you, let me ask you again. What was the Bush administration's position on the legality or illegality of settlements?
My memory is that we never said the settlements are illegal, nor had the Reagan administration. We tried to avoid the word illegal and illegitimate and just say that they were an obstacle to peace. That was our formula. An obstacle to peace. Look, we made a deal with Ariel Sharon on settlements. Our problem was that at the very, very beginning of the administration, we had the so-called Mitchell report from George Mitchell, which said there had to be a settlement freeze in the settlements. There had to be a construction freeze. Settlements, Jerusalem, including natural growth. That used to drive Ariel Sharon crazy. And as I tell in the book, he would say to us, "What do you mean including natural growth? People can't have babies?" And he said to Steve Hadley and me at one point, young men come out of the IDF, having risked their lives for our country, he said, and now it's time to marry and have a family, and in many cases they want to live close to one or the other or both sets of parents who may live in the settlement. I'm going to tell them, no, you may not do that. I'm not going to do that, he said. So what was the deal we had? We thought, if you build up and in, Ma'ale Adumim, settlement, town, city, 38,000 people roughly, suppose you put another apartment house in the middle of it, another 400 people. It doesn't hurt the Palestinians. Ma'ale Adumim isn't going anywhere anyway. If you build a new settlement on hundreds and hundreds of acres, that can disadvantage the Palestinians, and that does make negotiations harder. So the deal with Sharon was no new settlements. He said, we don't plan any. No financial inducements to move to a settlement, like a cheaper mortgage than you would get if you moved to Haifa. And Sharon said, that's fine. And Bibi Netanyahu, who was finance minister, said, great, because it's a budget buster. Thirdly, construction should be in the constructed areas of settlements, up and in, as we put it. We said that partly because if you put that apartment house at the very edge of a settlement, now you're going to need a security road around it, and you are expanding the settlement. The Israelis, not 100%, 95% kept to those rules. In 2000, Ehud Barak offers Arafat roughly 95% of the West Bank. The rest is settlement. 8 years later, the end of 2008, Ehud Olmert offers Abbas 96%. So I don't understand these claims that construction in settlements is making the two-state solution impossible. That would be true if the land area of the settlements used to be 5%, then it was 10%, now it's 17%, it's going to be 20%. That is not happening. Mm-hmm. That is not happening. The population increase is mostly in the major blocks, which is where most people want to live. Candidly, I don't believe the Israelis should be doing construction beyond the fence. I think that's a senseless use of resources. But we had the settlement deal. And it is very unfortunate, in my view, that at the beginning of the Obama administration, they said, particularly Secretary Clinton said, there was no deal. Well, there was no treaty. If you're looking for a treaty, there was certainly a deal.
Yes, but you should explain. She meant there was no deal on
settlements.
But because what Israel claimed was there was an understanding between the Bush administration and Israel that certain type of construction was in fact something that the Bush administration
would not object to.
But Hillary Clinton claimed it was never in writing. Was she right?
Depends what kind of writing. Here's what I mean. If by writing you mean a treaty of some sort, that's correct. But we and they referred to this agreement all the time.
Yes, there was no question.
Speeches after speeches by Sharon saying, and we will meet our obligations with respect to settlements as we have agreed with the United States. So that there was a deal. I mean, the notion that, well, hand me the piece of paper. There were a million pieces of paper we could have handed her from the embassy, from the State Department. Look, an administration has the right legally to say, if it's not a treaty obligation, we can abandon it. They did abandon it. I just don't think it was wise.
Mm-hmm.
The person who said that, in a sense, I can't let the Americans out-Palestinian me, was Mahmoud Abbas. He said in a famous interview in Newsweek that he said the president got him up a tree, not the president, the Americans got me up a tree and then started cutting. So that's what happened on the settlement issue, and we're not out of that yet, because the Palestinians are still saying, any construction, no negotiations. 4 years without negotiations because of this, in my view, foolish error.
I say to myself, if I'm a Palestinian and I'm serious about peace, nothing would prevent me from wanting to sit opposite Bibi Netanyahu and call his bluff. And I wouldn't care whether there was settlement growth or non-settlement growth. Elliott, the prize, the good that would happen for the Palestinian people if peace were achieved, if there were a recognized Palestinian state somewhere on the West Bank, is so overwhelming that I don't understand why, if I'm a leader, anything would prevent me from saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu, you said you'd come to Ramallah, I'll meet you on Thursday. Let him not show up, because that would make a statement that would be very good for the Palestinians. Although my instinct is Bibi will be there. Bibi will come anywhere at any time. But if I'm wrong, let Abbas call his bluff. So I don't understand, and I'm asking it as a serious question. What do you think it means that there's a reason why that Abbas doesn't feel he can come to a negotiating table now, if there's, even with settlement growth, what's keeping him within his own constituency, with his own personality? What prevents him from sitting with is Bibi Netanyahu now and saying to him, okay, let's start with no preconditions?
Remembering that this is the Mahmoud Abbas who said no or walked away from Ehud Olmert when he made an offer. This is the guy we're talking about. Why? What prevents him? Hamas, to begin with. That strong current of opinion among Palestinians that we don't want a peace agreement with Israel. We want Israel to go away. We are not reconciled to the existence of the state of Israel. So that's both political power, military power, and the accusation that he knows will be made against him. You're a traitor to the Palestinian people. For a second, I think, in his own character, again, I don't think he's a great heroic leader. You know, he's not Alexander the Great. He's not Winston Churchill. He's a kind of conciliatory figure. President Bush used to wonder, you know, is he the guy who's going to lead them into the promised land? That was the question. There's a third thing that I'd add now. It does not excuse Abbas in the Bush second term. There's no Arab support of the sort that there was. 2002, the Saudis offered their peace plan. This is a bad plan, but it is.
What was the worst thing about the plan?
Refugees.
Right.
Basically, it said,
But
all go back.
Exactly. But I thought the Saudi plan is still on the table.
Well, it is formally on the table, but the Saudis came out in 2002 and say, under the right circumstances, we, Saudi Arabia, would make peace with Israel. 100% support for Mubarak and Egypt. These are the two key powers. Fast forward to 2013, Mubarak is gone. Is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt making that? No. In Saudi Arabia, let's be candid, the king is really in very bad shape physically. He is not able to lead in that way or any way. So if you're a boss and you're not looking around, where's my Arab support? Which Arab leaders, important Arab leaders, are going to stand up and say, I'm with you. I'll be in Ramallah with you. I'll stand with you when you sign. Nobody. So I think if you're a boss and you look at this, you think, I want to prevent more settlements. I want to improve the situation on the ground. I want to improve the diplomatic situation, which they did at the UN. But a difficult peace negotiation with lots of compromises, I don't need to jump into that.
Then the reality is, Elliott, you don't believe there's any possibility for some real peace settlement in the near future.
Correct. I do not believe it. I don't see the conditions. Let me put it this way. The most the Israelis can offer today is less than the least the Palestinians are going to be willing to accept today.
Say it again.
The most the Israelis can offer today is less than the Palestinians
Than the least.
Less than the least the Palestinians can realistically accept today. And add to that, again, look at the region. Both the Israelis and Palestinians need Arab involvement. The Palestinians need cover. They need Arab leaders to say, you did the right thing, we're with you. The Israelis need peace with the other Arabs. What are they getting from the Palestinians? Not a lot. The real peace dividend for the Israelis is the peace with all those Arab countries around. You're not going to get that today because of the Arab Spring. So when you look at it from both sides, I don't see it. Can the situation be improved? Sure. Pragmatic negotiations. What I like to call parallel unilateral steps by each side. You don't have to sign anything.
Interesting. Parallel unilateral.
Yes. Each side says, with the Americans in the middle, what can you do yourself that might make things a bit easier between the two of you and on the other side? And there are some things. Not a peace treaty. I don't think, if we look now, let's say the Obama 4 years, this is not going to happen, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Has Bibi Netanyahu made any serious mistake of which you're critical?
I would not say, a sort of gigantic mistake like, as I explain in the book, Ehud Olmert's mistake in going to war in Lebanon in 2006, which I think was a mistake that Sharon would not have made. I think Bibi has made missteps, I'd put it that way. I think, for example, this business of the Palestinian statehood in the UN, I think the Israelis called so much attention to that. They built up its importance. On E1, which is the area between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, the Prime Minister announced that they would build. Well, he hasn't built. I think it was mostly done for electoral reasons. I don't think that announcement helped Israel. I don't think it helped him either. These are, what I'd call political missteps. I don't think there's a major error.
There are people within the American Jewish community who believe he has not done enough to give Palestinians the confidence that Israel really means it when it says we want the two-state solution. There are people who look at Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech and say, yes, he said it, but if you scratch beneath the surface, he doesn't mean it. And the way you know he doesn't mean it is he has not been proactive enough in doing the things that would build confidence within the Palestinian community. Is that criticism accurate?
I think it's unfair. There are things, again, you could do differently. For example, the Israelis collect withholding taxes for the Palestinians, import-export taxes. I think those should be handed over. They're not the Israelis' money, it's the Palestinians' money. Give it to them, it's theirs. The business of yes, no, now, later, I don't think that does anyone any good. Again, not a huge mistake, it's a mistake. But I would defend Netanyahu. Remember this, he, not the so-called left-of-center Kadima government, he has allowed thousands and tens of thousands of Israeli Arabs to shop in the West Bank, which is great for their economy. He has allowed more and more and more Palestinians from the West Bank to work in Israel or come as traders in Israel. He has removed scores of checkpoints and barriers that increase mobility tremendously. Palestinians I know tell me, I took a cab from Jerusalem to Nablus, I could never do that before. He did that. And you know what credit he has gotten for it? Zero, including, I'm afraid to say, from the US government. And that's not fair.
Okay. I also want to draw upon your experience from within the White House and as national security, within the national security team. There has been a discussion in the aftermath of the Hagel nomination and then the Hagel confirmation hearings, and he is now the Secretary of Defense. And it goes like this, Elliott. Don't worry about anything Hagel may have said. In the end, the Secretary of Defense doesn't set policy. He is basically an administrator who executes the president's policy. So if the president says, and means it, containment is not an option, whether Hegel was for containment or not is really irrelevant. At the same time, we heard when Cheney and Rumsfeld were part of your administration, they wielded much too much power. They set policy. There's even this notion that you hear very often, George Bush wasn't the real president, Dick Cheney was the real president, and he drove policy. I'm asking you to address two questions at the same time. One, I want to know what the truth is from your perspective about the Bush years. To what extent were others like a Cheney and Rumsfeld driving American foreign policy? And how does this play into the general philosophical question? What kind of power does a secretary have, whether defense, state, whatever, and how does it therefore apply in the Hegel nominations and confirmation hearings?
Let me start by saying, Barack Obama is president, George Bush was president, and the key policies for Bush, let's say, to invade Iraq, to have the surge, this kind of really significant policy development, the policy toward Israel and Arafat, this is Bush. The decision to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan, this is Obama. Yes, people have aides, they have advisors, people argue, they write papers. The president makes the decisions on those critical issues. But the but is that, once you decide, if you're a president, we're going to do the surge, you don't implement it yourself.
Of course.
You have a gigantic bureaucracy there under the Secretary of Defense.
A gigantic bureaucracy.
Gigantic. I mean, millions in the case of DOD. Who implements this policy? Who decides, where do the troops come from? Who will lead the troops? Who's going to get promoted from colonel to general? These are issues. Which weapon systems? The president doesn't decide that. A Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense has enormous discretion on all of these issues. Again, on weapons, of course, Congress has a role, but on promotions, whose career is blighted and whose career leaps ahead, on relations with foreign militaries, on the disposition of troops. The Secretary of Defense, again, not alone. I mean, there are the service secretaries, there's a deputy secretary, but these are important jobs. I mean, Obama is his own Secretary of State. That doesn't mean that the Secretary of State, Clinton, for the first 4 years, is an unimportant figure who should be forgotten about. Because, the State Department, to move to the State Department, you make 1 million decisions a day. You have cables in and out. You have conversations. People come to see, and they listen. And what they're listening for example, on Israel, tone. You used the word tone before. What's the tone that they're hearing? On Iran today, what's the tone? There are 1,000 ways of saying the United States our policy is not containment, our policy is prevention. One of them is to say, our policy is not containment, our policy. Another is to slam your fist on the table and say, now you listen to me. Makes a big difference. And the president can't see everybody. The president sees one, let's say the head of state, the king, the president, the prime minister. There are 1,000 other meetings, including at the Defense Department. So I think the argument that Secretary of Defense is an inconsequential job, it's not a policy job, is wrong. It's a hugely important job. Secretary of Defense may not be an important job in Belgium. I doubt that it's a very important job in Italy. It's a hugely important job for the world's only superpower.
Mm-hmm. Now address the Cheney-Rumsfeld issue. To what extent were they driving policy as opposed to Bush on the war in Iraq and in general on the philosophy of democratization throughout the world?
When I came to the White House, I remember it was a few days, I went to my first meeting in the Oval Office, the Bush White House. And I had read in the newspapers, Cheney was like prime minister. So we go into the Oval Office. It was a meeting about immigration policy, actually. You have the president, vice president, secretary of state, attorney general, a few others. And the attorney general began. It was John Ashcroft back then. Mr. President, we're having this meeting to talk about immigration policy. The question is, 30 seconds. Bush interrupts. I want this, I want that, I want the other thing. You do this, you do that, you tell me. Totally in charge. So I knew that the newspaper version of this was false. Cheney had real influence. Rumsfeld, real influence. Powell had real influence until 9/11. After that, I think it began to wither. You know, the key decisions for the George Bush years, like the Barack Obama years, the key decisions are made at the top. They're made by one person. Advisors, plenty. But I think the notion that Rumsfeld and Cheney were in charge took too much power away from the presidency, which is really what's being said here. In my experience, it's nonsensical.
Did they sway him in terms of influencing him to go to war in Iraq?
You know, I was not involved in the Iraq war discussions. I'm sure they had an influence for the right reason, which is he respected the experience and intelligence of both men. That's why he chose them. Particularly Rumsfeld had been Secretary of Defense, so I'm sure they had an influence on him. But you know, fundamentally, after 9/11, Bush made up his mind about the nature of that event, the nature of the Middle East, the problem in the Muslim world, the nature of terrorism against America. He's the person who decided to go to war with Iraq.
Okay. As far as you know, did Ariel Sharon advise him not to?
Never in my presence. Now again, I come into the relationship with Sharon in 2002, late in 2002.
So that's much later.
It's
already.
later. I have read people saying that
Alan Dershowitz says it all the time. I don't know if it's true.
It's conceivable because, of course, Sharon was very concerned, among other things, about Iran, not surprisingly. And there is this line, this sort of half joke, we had the wrong war. But Sharon also thought that Saddam Hussein was a butcher. And the Israelis, like everyone else, were incredibly impressed with this display of American military prowess.
Okay. Ultimately, Sharon, who had been with Menachem Begin, the architect of the Greater Israel philosophy for a period of time, really drove the early settlement policy, Ariel Sharon and Menachem Begin, then had the disaster in Lebanon, then becomes prime minister, and lo and behold, Ariel Sharon decides on a unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And this happens under your watch.
Yes.
It is ultimately going to lead to elections, which you describe in detail, wonderful sections on that whole period of time. I just want a summary for our audience here. Number one, with the benefit of hindsight, was Ariel Sharon wrong to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza?
$64,000 question, as we used to say. I do not believe he was wrong to withdraw from Gaza. I think that he was wrong not to cooperate more with the Palestinian Authority in an effort to prevent this from seeming like a Hamas victory, which is what it looked like. It's not an accident that 5 months after the withdrawal, Hamas wins the election, because they said, we drove the Israelis out. So I think that was a mistake. I do not think, I know this is controversial in Israel, the Gaza withdrawal. I do not think Israel would be better off today with 7,000 Jews in the middle of 1.5 million Palestinians, particularly if you had a Hamas government there, which you would have had in 2007. So I think Sharon withdrew from Gaza as a general who viewed it as a terrible strain on the IDF, permanent strain, and because he said, look, there's no future that I can see. There's no peace deal I can see that has us in Gaza in the long run. So if that's true, and there's a huge strain on the IDF, it pays to do it. I would just add he made one big mistake on the Israeli side, never mind cooperating more with the Palestinian Authority, which might have worked, might not have worked. He should have said to the settlers, I know I helped send you. You are heroes of this country and heroes of Zionism. You have made unbelievable sacrifices. I have to ask you to make yet another, which is to come out. Instead, what was really kind of communicated was fanatics, tired of you, tired of the cost of supporting you, bunch of right-wing nuts. Huge mistake, which I think toward the very end Sharon realized. And that is, I think, part of the reason that the settlers were so embittered, was the way they were treated.
That's a very sensitive comment by you. Now, I asked you in retrospect, what was Elliott Abrams thinking at the time? What did the White House think at the time when you hear Sharon is going to withdraw?
We were in favor of it. I was, the White House was. There's a great story in there about my secret trip to Rome to see Sharon about what was he going to do. We didn't cram this down. This is Sharon's idea to get out of Gaza. We thought it's sensible from a military point of view. With the negotiations dead in the water, this is the end of 2003, 2004. Why? Because Arafat was still there. We thought this moves things forward. This shows the Israelis are willing to do something they hadn't done before. Give up land to the Palestinians, not to Egypt.
Yes.
So we thought it was a very useful step forward by Sharon, and Bush was 100% supportive. We asked him to be more cooperative with the Palestinians. He didn't do that, and I think he didn't do it for domestic political reasons. I think because he wanted to be able to say, this is no gift to the Palestinians. I didn't do it for them. I didn't do it for the Americans. I didn't even talk to them. I did it for us by myself, but it was a mistake.
Your book does address the fact that Condoleezza Rice, the Bush administration, pushed for elections in Gaza after Israel withdrew, and lo and behold, you ended up with Hamas. I don't know, was it a mistake?
It was not a mistake to have elections. They had a presidential election, January 2005, went fine. Having parliamentary elections was not a mistake. Letting Hamas run was a mistake.
How could you stop it?
That was the problem, because the Palestinians themselves said to us, if we don't let these guys run, it's like a Syrian election. It's like a Mubarak election. In other words, you have one opposition, you don't let them run. We still shouldn't have done it. A terrorist group should not be permitted to run unless and until it lays down its arms. The compromise we came up with, which was, well, if they lay down their arms afterwards, then they, mistake.
It was a mistake.
It was a mistake.
Okay. So as we close, I will give you one more chance to just state for our audience, and you've already said you do not see in any near-term sense a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What do you see happening? What's the best that we as Americans and as American Jews can hope for or work for that would help both the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Middle East in general? What would you want of us?
I think we should try, for now, I'm not talking about 25 years from now, for now, to work with the Israelis and Palestinians to improve the situation in the West Bank. More autonomy, more self-government, more physical mobility, more prosperity. Let them build for themselves a better life and begin building toward a Palestinian state at a future date. I think we can do that. I think we can improve the situation on the ground. I don't think we should be looking for great ceremonies on the White House lawn. We should be looking for reality.
I told you before, I have been in your presence so many times, learned from you in so many ways. This has been fabulous. You are fabulous.
Thank you.
And you have written a book which I believe will be a classic and will be, it is not, as you say, this is not a textbook. It's a great read. And I'm hoping everybody makes this part of their home library, Tested by Zion by Elliott Abrams. But it is simply the most recent of your many contributions to the American scene and to the history of the Middle East. I wish you every best, and I thank you so much for giving me some time. All the best to you. You're marvelous. Thank you. And that was my meeting with Elliott Abrams, whose book Tested by Zion is simply out of this world, and I really hope every one of you picks it up. It is published by Cambridge, and you can get it not only at a bookstore, wherever they still exist, but also on Amazon. And I'm really hoping you'll be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you have to the ideas expressed by Elliott Abrams. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And by the way, if you'd like to be in touch with Elliott Abrams yourself, you can do so by emailing me. I will forward your emails on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.